Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my 9th presentation in a series of 10 talks that I will have done on board this ship. And welcome back to this wonderful venue. And really, I am so honored and I appreciate this attendance. You guys make this all worthwhile. Goals for today. I want to look again at some conceptual housekeeping. Also, Rainforests 101. I want to give you a realistic understanding of rainforests. I don't want to talk the numbers and all of this. I just want to give you a feeling for why it is so important, what it means in the big picture of our planet's survival. Also, we need to talk about diversity. I want to look at some representative species, not a lot. I'll do more species in my final talk. But I will talk about the orangutan, and also a bit on geographic literacy. And in fact, that's where we're going to start right now. Where in the world are we? Well, let's look at some of these major land masses here. We've got Indochina, and you should be familiar with this by now because I've been going over this in the past few lectures. We have Malaysia, and we have Sumatra. And actually, those three places are important because you're going to be visiting them. Later on in a few weeks, you're going to be coming around right along that route. So much of what I said will be applicable to those ports and those regions as well. Continuing in our view of the world, next we have Java, Sulawesi, going up north to the Philippines, and then Borneo right in the center. We left the port of Semarang, crossed through the Java Sea. The Viking Sun is out here in the South China Sea on our way to Bandar Seri Begawan. If we look at Borneo as an island of Borneo, I want to talk a little bit about its geopolitical lines here. We have an island that is divided up into three countries. We've got Indonesia in the southern part. We have Malaysia taking up quite a bit of the northern area. And then isolated on the shore, we have Brunei. And if we do a close-up of that, we're going to notice that Brunei is actually in two parts that are separated. If we look at Bandar Seri Begawan, we've got the city right there, a little bit in from the place where we'll be berthing. And I've got a satellite photo here showing a little bit more about that. This is the harbor in Muara, and the main part of the city is further inland right there. So that should give you a little bit of a feel for where we actually berth and where many of us will be going. If we go up the coast to Kota Kinabalu, and we have another satellite image, most likely, and remember, things always change, we'll be berthing down here. Those of you who will be going up to the cultural village will be going about 10 miles or so up into the hills. Later, when I conclude this presentation, I have a movie that actually takes you up to that area as well. Now let's look at conceptual housekeeping. And actually, before I go there, somebody asked me a question before, and I said, oh yeah, I forgot to bring the full connection in about whales not getting the bends. Whales generally don't get the bends, and you learned all about the science of the bends. The reason why is that whales can move around the site of where that nitrogen gas was. So instead of it being in the blood where it can form those bubbles, it moves the nitrogen or the nitrogen-saturated tissues into other tissues that it has, so it does not have to worry about getting the bends. However, if a whale is suddenly startled, and this happened out in the west coast of the United States where there were military bases in the Pacific Northwest, there were some explosions which startled the whales, and apparently that interfered with the whale's ability to move around that nitrogen gas. And when they did autopsies on the whales, what they saw suggested that these whales had gotten the bends. And that's that connection there. Conceptual housekeeping. 2 days ago, someone came up to me and they said, hey, I've got a question about chop and also these swells that are occurring. So what's the difference? Why do we have like rough seas, we have these little crashing waves, and we have swells? And I thought it was a great way of starting this presentation. The difference between these two different movements of water is that chop generally has what's called a shorter period. What it means is that you get wave, 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 and they're not far apart. They're relatively close together. And these are the waves that we're most familiar with that we might see whitecapping. Whereas swells have a much longer period. They're not as close together. They're not bunched up together. And if we look at the heights, generally chop will have less of these wave height. If we look at water that begins to take on more of the characteristics of swells, it can begin to grow to a greater height. In fact, when we go into an area that has long swells, that's when we begin to feel the boat roll from side to side. Both of these types of waves are caused by wind. In fact, the currents are caused by wind. Wind is what drives these water movements. If the wind blows over a relatively short area, a short span, and it could even be a quick time that it does it, a short time, you can produce little waves. In order to produce these swells, what you need to have is the wind blowing over a longer bit, and it's called fetch. It'll grow over a wider span, a longer span of water, so that it's able to put more energy in that water to create these much longer waves. Now, sometimes you can get both. Everybody remember that? You get it when you have swells, and superimposed on the swells, you have chop. Very nasty seas. However, this boat, this ship, I should say, is incredible. Why is it so stable? Well, it's stable because it has what I like to call intelligent stabilizers. If you go up to the deck that has the model of the ship, go take a look at it, because I went there to see if those stabilizers showed, and sure enough they do. They are right here. These are stabilizers which come out from the hull, and they look like airplane wings. You can see it right here in the model. When you don't need them, they fold back. When you need them, the captain engages them and they come up like this. Those stabilizers are tied into a gyroscope that is on board this ship, which detects roll. As soon as that device detects, whoa, we're going over this way, what it does is it sets the angle of those blades to counteract it and work, either lifting that side of the ship up or sending it down to counteract the force driving it in the other direction. So what stabilizes this is intelligent, on-demand movement of those wings that stick out. You know what it's like? Do you remember being a kid and sticking your hand out the window of a car? And you can go like this and your hand goes up, and you go like that, the hand goes down as the car is going along. Similar to how these stabilizers work to counter the roll of the ship. Actually, they don't work very well with pitch. It doesn't work with up and down like that. You don't have that. Generally, what happens on poor seas, and I think the Admiral might be able to tell you a little bit more, is that you then, if the seas are getting that rough, is you change your bearing so that you're not going right into the waves. All right, wave physics. Since we're on waves, let's talk about them. It's critical to note that the energy is what moves when you see a wave. It's not the water. You look at a wave and you see the wave moving, and most people would think that, this is the mass of water coming along. Not so. Mostly the water stays put. It's the energy that is in that system that moves along. How many of you remember a child's toy called Slinky? Everybody remember that? Yeah, it was that big metal spring. And if I were to take that spring and stretch it across this stage here and push it really quickly, you'd see that there'd be a compression that would move along the Slinky and come back. Or if you skipped rope, you can hold one end of a rope here, one end here, and I can snap the rope quickly and it puts a wave that goes down the rope. That is what happens with water waves. It's the energy that moves in. And you can see here that there is some forward movement. But that forward movement occurs mostly at the surface. The deeper you go, the less forward movement there is. So these are surface wind-driven waves. There's another type of wave, nasty wave, called a tsunami. And that look familiar? Think back to your old movie days from decades ago. If you don't know, give you a hint. Leslie Nielsen playing one of his really dramatic roles in here. This was the movie called The Poseidon Adventure. It was hell upside down. And one of the interesting pieces in here is that the ship, let me show you a picture of it, that's the model that they used. And you can see the sleuth that the water came down, which created the wave, which was used to take that first picture. But if we look at this, why am I bringing it up? At midnight on New Year's Eve, the SS Poseidon was struck by a 90-foot tidal wave and capsized. Tidal waves are not 90 feet, not in the ocean. If we encountered a tidal wave in the ocean, it would be probably a towering 1.5 feet at most. It's this tall out of the ocean. It is small. But what happens is when a tidal wave, it has very different characteristics than those wind-driven waves. When these tsunamis, I should call them tsunamis and not tidal waves, when these tsunamis approach land, they do what is called feeling bottom, and their characteristics begin to change, and this is what begins to happen when a tsunami reaches the shoreline. And by the way, a tsunami is not driven by wind. What causes a tsunami is a movement of large blocks of earth. An earthquake might do it. That's why when there's an earthquake, you have all these tsunami warnings that tsunamis might develop. But the biggest tsunami on record occurred up in Alaska, and that was due to a landslide. This landslide came off the side of a bay, went in there, created this huge wave which struck the other side of the bay. And that is some concern with some of the volcanoes that are in the Canary Islands, but that's another story in itself. The word, by the way, tsunami, comes from the Japanese for harbor wave. Again, we're looking at something which is inshore where it is doing its damage. When you go further from the shore, you have less impact from that tsunami. There's one other type of wave I want to mention. It's called a rogue wave. Rogue waves are very different. These are really waves which come out of the perfect storm. Just the right seas are there. The waves are coming in. The wind is perfectly right. These rogue waves don't last for long. At most, they may last for several minutes. In fact, they have been captured on satellite. And these rogue waves can tower, well, they can tower to the height of a 9-story building. And that's recorded from ships. I believe the buoys have recorded rogue waves at about 60, 65 feet in height. Pretty large. Another great read, if you haven't done it, is The Perfect Storm. The Perfect Storm is much more than the story of the Andrea Gail, that sword fishing boat that left Gloucester, New England. It goes into really the history and even the science of what it is like to be out in a storm and fighting the elements. Celestial navigation. That was one more thing in the conceptual housekeeping I want to mention. I want to make sure that you realize that Polaris has a fixed position. I mean, it's always going to be north, and if you're not moving, if you're not cruising, it's always going to be at that same elevation, and that's the elevation that gets you your latitude. But a cool thing for you to do, because most of you have cameras, is if you have a tripod or some way of steadying your camera and the ability to do a very long exposure, you can aim your camera at Polaris. Polaris doesn't move, but all of the other stars in the sky move. They go around Polaris. So if you're able to take a photograph of that, what your image looks like is something like that. It is so cool. And you can see the other stars that are just superimposed here on those circular patterns, tracing out the paths of those stars as they moved across the sky. One other thing to consider is that since we are in the very low latitudes right now, only I think we've just crossed the equator, Polaris is not going to be very high in the sky. That is why I suggested doing this at Manila. In our next set of ports, I believe it will be at about 5 degrees off the horizon. And how much of that is in a fist? How much was a fist? 10, so it would be half a fist. It's going to be hard to see. That's why I suggested at least doing it in Manila, but certainly most of you do not live in the tropics, and you're going to be able to see that very viable as it goes to 3 and 4 fists height. All right, let's get into the focus of rainforests. I'm going to start it off with a true or false, 50% chance of getting it right. Although only a fraction, about 6% of our planet's surface is covered by rainforests, it is the home to about half of Earth's plant and animal species. Think about it, and the answer is? Yeah, but you can't trust me because that sometimes moves. This time it didn't. Yes, that is true. It is home to about half of our planet's species, which means that we are on the biodiversity cruise. We have hit the major places for biodiversity. In the marine environment, found on tropical coral reefs, and certainly we've been to our share of coral reefs. Also, in the terrestrial environment, the biodiversity comes in at that tropical rainforest. Diversity, diversity, diversity. That's why I've got this fruit fly, Drosophila, up here. And the reason Drosophila is up here is that this animal gave us insight to diversity. Let's go back to a previous lecture that I gave. It was one on talking about different types of species and how they changed over time. And we talked about two individuals, Lamarck and Darwin, having opposing views. Lamarck said there was something called acquired characteristics. A baby giraffe stretches its neck, keeps stretching its neck, and its babies have a longer neck. Their babies keep doing it, you get longer and longer necks. That was acquired characteristics. Darwin comes along, says, inherited characteristics are what is the scene here, and what happens is you have two different populations. The one who survive have the babies, and that is the difference in natural selection. Very different. But Darwin, if you remember, could not explain why there was diversity. It takes experiments on the fruit fly to figure that out. At the end of the 1800s, the fruit fly became a very popular laboratory animal in genetics because it reproduced so quickly. And it was easy to keep. Some of the earlier experiments in the 1900s looked at radiation-induced mutations. So what we had were fruit flies, exposing them to X-rays, and what this produced was a series of offspring that had different types of mutations. Some had long wings, short wings, big eyes, red eyes, white eyes, black bodies. But all of this was news to scientists because at this time they were also putting together DNA and trying to understand what this obscure monk Mendel talked all about and putting it together. And this said something. It said something about the blueprints of life. And we know that now as being DNA, where DNA has a code on it which codes for the substances which make you who you are. And what X-rays did was that they changed the DNA code and they produced diversity in the offspring. So we know that radiation can do that. We also know that sunlight can do it. Ultraviolet can produce that. If indeed the radiation does not affect my sperm or a woman's egg, then you're not going to create a mutation in the next generation. But what you can do is send a cell on an errant voyage of proliferation, and that is called cancer. So what cancer is all about is changing that DNA code that the cell now does not keep maintenance or does not produce new cells which are highly specialized. What it does is it goes into a proliferation mode and starts making more and more and more cells. There's also chemical mutagens that are out there. There were gases, mustard gas in World War I. Obviously, other chemicals not affecting the genes, but affecting cells and producing a cancerous state. However, the normal replication process that you have in your cells is an error-rich process. You're always making mistakes. They're always making mistakes, which means this is ensuring that you're going to have a diversity of offspring. Most of the time, you have chemicals, and I love the names of them. One is called repairase, and it's an enzyme which repairs the mistakes in DNA, and it goes in there, snips it out, and all of a sudden another enzyme helps really smooth out the code so that the code makes sense again. It's an error-rich process which leads to new inheritable traits. Some types of pathogens, such as HIV, have a very highly error-prone process. They don't use, by the way, DNA. Anybody remember RNA? I'm just curious. They use a totally different nucleic acid, and actually HIV does some incredible stuff being a retrovirus. But it is highly prone to errors. So is Ebola. Ebola is another RNA virus, highly prone to errors. Why should I care? Well, since you have so many errors in the DNA and you're producing different proteins on the surface of these particles, we cannot target them with a wide spectrum vaccine because they all look a little bit different. And those are the problems, or the initial problems in looking at HIV vaccines and Ebola vaccines, a high rate of mutation. Okay, let's get back to diversity of rainforests. Rainforests can offer us a number of different things. There's 7,000 medical compounds. 70% of the plants with anti-cancer properties come from rainforests. And to make this a little bit more personal, let's talk about this drug right here, Calanolide A. And if we look at it, it was originally found in the Borneo rainforest. And it had certain properties with interfering with DNA. Because remember, cancer is all about DNA changes, and they thought it was going to be a cancer treatment. However, this did not pan out in the labs. But what it turned out to be was an anti-HIV drug. Whoa, we've got a new anti-HIV drug that we can add to our arsenal. Let's go back and go collect it in Borneo. They returned to Borneo, to where they originally got this stuff. It wasn't there. It was gone. All the trees which were a source of this chemical were burned. They were gone. They had to go to the botanical garden in Sumatra to get the trees, and then from that they developed a chemical manufacturing process to make that. Other wonderful sources of great food. Has anybody been trying those wonderful fruits that are upstairs? I mean, Chef Eric, he's right on putting all this stuff out there. Talk to him about the use of these foods for your health. I mean, he is an encyclopedia of knowledge on it. So he'll tell you about each of the fruits and tell you why they are helping you out. Which ones? This one, in fact, has anti-cancer properties. All right, what is a rainforest? You know, you can look at all the fancy definitions of it, but we distill that down to basically it's a forest with rain, plenty of rain. Duh, a rainforest. So what is a forest? And a forest is really an ecosystem which is dominated by woody vegetation, by trees. Pretty much easy to see there. And ecologists, like zoologists, like to place things in categories. So they look at forests and they said, you know what, we're going to divide forests up by the climate that they're in. And we're going to say that they're a tropical forest which straddle the equator. Then going off to either side, we have cooler, temperate forests. And then finally, we have these very cold, dry forests called boreal forests. There are also changes in forests depending upon your altitude, because not only is temperature dependent upon how far you get from the equator, but also for how far you go up. In fact, as you begin to climb, the temperature begins to go down, maybe about 5 degrees or so for every 1,000 feet. In fact, when you're flying in your airplane, in like months from now when you leave the cruise, you might be at 36,000 feet, comfortable inside the cabin, but your outside temperature at 36,000 feet could be at minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It's incredible. So getting back to rainforest, we've got a concept of what a forest is, the major categories of forest. What about what is rain? Well, rain is really overweight water droplets. Really, if you look up and see clouds, what you're seeing in that white, fluffy stuff are really tiny little raindrops, so small that the local updrafts keep it up in the air. So you've got dust, you've got little tiny water droplets that are up there being kept up by little minute currents. However, as water condenses, as more water forms on these smaller drops, the drops get bigger and bigger and bigger until they get too large to be supported by those updrafts. And what happens then? They come down. And that's what rain is all about. Rainforest test. The northernmost rainforest on our planet is found in A, Norway, B, Alaska, C, Nepal, or D, Costa Rica. Think about that for a moment. Where is the northernmost rainforest? And the answer to that one is Norway. You got to be kidding me. Rainforests are up in Norway. In fact, if we look at the map right here, in Namdalen, the rainforest is about 100 miles south of the Arctic Circle. It's incredible. It's not a tropical rainforest. Obviously, it's not a tropical one. Very different types of species, not as rich in diversity, but with the definition of a lot of rain coming in and the structure of it, we have a rainforest there. For those of you who said Alaska, you're not that far off. Just several hundred miles south of there, on that latitude line in Prince William Sound, we have rainforests. And these are the temperate rainforests. Anybody here ever do an inside passage cruise? Yeah, you went through all rainforests that were right along the coastline there. Incredible. Okay, let's get back to Borneo itself. Borneo has two main types of rainforests. They have what are called lowland rainforests, and they have what are called montane rainforests. If we look at the lowland rainforest, we find that they're wet. They get about 8 inches of rain per month. They're steady in their temperature. The temperature doesn't fluctuate a lot. And also they have very tall trees. If you take a look at this photo, you can see something right there, and that is mist, fog, or ground clouds. They also have a lot of moisture so that there's even clouds. In fact, some of the plants don't have roots that go into the soil, but their roots hang out, and those roots absorb the water that's in the mist and fog around them, and that's how they meet their water needs. There's another problem with rainforest trees, and that is getting water up from the soil to the top of that tree, which can be as tall as a 20-story building. And that is a process called transpiration. And what transpiration is all about, it's brilliant. It's like you drinking on a straw. The leaves up at the top of the tree have tiny holes in them. They're called stomates. And through these stomates, the tree will release water. The water evaporates, and just like sucking up water in a straw, water is sucked up the tree, and it goes to nourish the vegetation of that tree that's up at the higher levels. And so it just continually goes into the roots, up the vascular system of the tree, and out the stomata. The other type of rainforest, and this one covers maybe about 6%, 7% of Borneo, is the montane rainforest. This is higher, it's cooler, and the trees are much shorter. And you can see them down here in the foothills of Mount Kinabalu. There's a third type. I lied. Let me put in the third type of rainforest. This one is called a monsoon rainforest, and we saw that in Semarang, has monsoon rainforest, and these are seasonal rainforests. They're only rainforests when you're getting the rain, and then in the dry season, they don't have the characteristics of a rainforest, and so they're not continual as those other ones are. It's a jungle out there, or is it? Question, true or false? According to many current definitions, a tropical rainforest can also be called a jungle. We've heard that, haven't we? And the answer to this one is false. Rainforest is not synonymous with jungle. Huh? What's the difference? Well, the difference to many is that a jungle is land that is overgrown with dense and impenetrable vegetation. If we look at the floor of a jungle, you can see right here that it's going to take quite a bit of effort to move through that. However, the floor of a rainforest is pretty sparse. You can see it right here. Much easier to move through. You don't have to hack your way through. Why? What's the difference? Well, what goes on here is that the canopy, the leaves up on top, can affect the amount of light that comes down to the floor of either of these ecosystems. With a thin canopy, quite a bit of light can get through, which means that you can have all vegetation growing on the floor of the jungle. With a rainforest, you have a very dense canopy which cuts out the light coming down. Therefore, you don't have many species that are living on the floor there. I might add, though, in certain times, if there's a fire or if you have devastation to part of a rainforest where you lose the canopy, certainly the flora then takes on the characteristics of a jungle until you cover it all up, and then many of those plants die. True or false? The rainforests are the lungs of the planet, producing most of the atmosphere's oxygen. Something that we all want to hear, right? kumbaya, this is going to be a wonderful thing here. And the problem is that it is false. Rainforests don't do that. Rainforests do not give us most of that oxygen. They give us a good percentage of it, maybe about 20%. Most is from the grass of the sea, plankton. Plankton produce the oxygen that all of us need. So what's the big deal about rainforests? Why are they so important? Why does everybody say, what are we doing to the rainforest? It has to do with this phrase right here. Rainforests fix carbon. Fix carbon, what is it, broken? I don't like the term fix. I'm going to replace that with the term I like better, and that is capture and store carbon. This is what rainforests are very good at, which makes them very important for the health of our planet. Well, what am I talking about? I've got to do the obligatory photosynthesis equation, but I'll try and make it nice. If we look at photosynthesis, I think all of us remember that as a process in which plants make their own food. In order for the process to occur, you've got to water the plants. The plants will also take in gases, will take in carbon dioxide. They need an energy source, and what's the energy source for photosynthesis? You got it, sunlight comes in there. So now we have all the ingredients, and what this does is it makes more vegetation. It makes more mass. It makes biological mass right here. In the process, it also produces a waste gas, which is oxygen. We're going to get rid of a couple of things here. And we're just going to look at why rainforests are so important. It is this line from carbon dioxide to vegetation. And later that vegetation gets stored in wood, which makes rainforests critical to the health of this planet, especially now. Why? Because carbon dioxide, what rainforests take out of the air, is the biggest contributor to human-caused climate change. That's it. So what they are doing are essentially taking out these greenhouse gases, a fair amount of greenhouse gas. And by the way, to just explain the greenhouse effect, what happens is that light energy streams into our planet. Normally it would get reflected back into space, but these greenhouse gases work like insulation, and they keep the heat inside, and the heat just keeps bouncing around, and that is what greenhouse warming is all about. So the more of those gases that have the characteristics of holding in heat that are in the atmosphere, the warmer our planet will get. But rainforests, get rid of it. This is a kind of a sobering image. This is a NASA space image showing burning rainforests. You can see it from space, but when you get close, that's what's going on. In a slash and burn type agriculture. Also, you're cutting down the trees for wood. So the rainforests are indeed facing challenges. Rainforests, as you walk through them and you see them for the next few weeks, take a look around, become a naturalist, become a scientist, because you're going to notice one thing immediately, that they are stratified, that there is certainly a forest floor, then there is a richer understory. Look up to the top and you will see a canopy which separates most of the rainforest from the outside elements. Occasionally you get things poking up out of that, and those are your emergent trees. And that is the stratification of a rainforest. The rainforest floor contains some of the most fertile soil. True or false? And the answer is, boy, everybody's done all their reading here. The answer is indeed, as you're saying, it is false. It does not. The reason why is anything that falls to the floor is quickly decomposed by fungus, by bacteria, by one-celled animals. They'll break it all down, and this becomes not available for other types of organisms. If we look at some of the interesting plants that are out there, I love this one. This is called the strangling fig. It is a tree. The fig tree is on the outside of this other tree. Actually, it was laid, the seed for this was laid in the upper branches of this tree by some sort of mammal that deposited the seed and some fertilizer up in the top of the tree. This plant, this strangling fig, grew down the tree, and it begins to strangle that inner tree. And you can see it in this image right here where that strangling fig is there. Over time, it kills the inner tree, and nothing is left except this circular exterior of the strangling fig. So look for those. Those are pretty good finds. Another strange plant in rainforest is called a corpse flower. This flower can be 20 pounds, over 20 pounds in weight. It is huge. It is called a corpse flower because it smells like decaying flesh. Why? Because it attracts flies. So the flies help pollinate and fertilize these flowers by smelling like decaying flesh. Ugh. It's also a parasitic plant. This plant does not have roots, doesn't have stems that you'd know it, or leaves. What it has is a system of these kind of creepy crawly things which invade the tissue of other plants, and they soak all the nutrients they need from the other plant. There are other type of interesting plants. This is a giant pitcher plant, which can hold about 2.5 liters of digestive juice. That's right in there. So animals, especially the little small mice, can fall in there, and they get digested. You can't get out. For the smaller insects, which it really traps in the smaller species, there are spines which point down. So the animal is able to go down the pitcher plant, but once it decides, this isn't the place I want to be, and they try getting up, the spines are all facing them, and they're stuck there. And they fall into the digestive juice, and they're part of the nutrition for this carnivorous plant. Ants. There are ants all over the place. These are fire ants. Fire ants will hold on to you with their mandibles, their jaws like this, but they won't inject the poison through their jaws. While they're holding on to you, they bring their abdomen around, and then what they do is sting you multiple times. Watch out for fire ants. Another type of ant is the army ant, and I love this army ant. Look at the mandibles. It's actually holding flesh together there. It's holding on to somebody's arm. Interesting connection to this. In certain cultures that did not have sutures, didn't have stitches, these ants would be used to close an open wound. Because what the local doctor, physician, medical person would do in these areas is that they take the two open sides of the wound, put them together, take an ant like this, put the ant there, crush down on it, and the jaws clamp down, and they hold that skin together. Incredible stories. Exploding ants. These are my favorite. These are in Borneo. These ants are crazy. The one on the right. If the one on the right sees an invader coming to its nest, what it does is it runs up to the invader, holds on to the invader, and then changes its musculature so it just kind of, and it explodes its body. It explodes this sticky, caustic substance that goes onto the invader, and the invading ant for the rest of the time is stuck with this corpse on it and all this caustic material on it. What incredible defenses. Weaver ants. These are ants that are found in many rainforests, and what they do is weave together nests. Well, what do they use to weave together nests? Thread? They use larval silk. They pick up their baby larvae, which have silk, and they use them to go thread and sew together leaves. Termites. Plenty of termites. You all know about the termites. By the way, you could tell the difference between a termite and an ant by looking at their antenna. Notice that these antennae are fairly straight and made up of little beads. Ants generally will have an antenna that goes straight for a while and then it bends off to the side. I'm sure you've seen those before in many ants, but that's one of the differences between termites and ants. Another is in the body sections. Ants tend to have three distinct body sections: a head, a middle part, a thorax, and an abdomen. Whereas you can see in these termites, really you have a head and then an abdomen region. And within that abdomen, you have what are called gut microbes. And these microbes break down cellulose. And that's why a termite is able to eat grass or wood or other types of vegetation, because it goes into its gut and these guys do their thing. Anteater. Isn't that a cool anteater? The pangolin, and that is common to the area. And the name itself comes from the Malaysian one who rolls up, because if you startle it, it goes into that. You want to see a real cute picture? This is a baby anteater. Right? Oh, who doesn't love that thing? Really? Much nicer than those fish that I showed yesterday. Paradise tree snake, a.k.a. the paradise flying snake. How does it get that name? Well, it can glide the length of a football field. It flattens out its body, and it can glide from tree to tree. Birds, they're glorified reptiles. I look at them, the scales that reptiles have, well, in birds they become feathers. The forelimbs of reptiles, in birds, they become wings. Cool birds, what are the ones you're going to see? Parrots. We've got a parakeet on the left, which is a type of parrot, just smaller. We've got the parrot on the right. Now, parrots are interesting. And why are they interesting? Well, read the story. True story. I don't make this up. So the question is, why? Why do birds speak? What's the whole deal with parrots talking? And it's peer pressure. Parrots like to fit in the natural with their own members of their local group. And so they talk to each other. They make bird sounds. When you bring a parrot into a human-dominated environment, the parrots still want to fit in, and they're able to make sounds which sound like humans. So they want to fit in with everybody, and that's why they'll go, hello, hello, and do all that wonderful stuff. Okay, last group I want to talk about are the primates. The primates came from tree-dwelling ancestors, and being tree-dwelling, they had a large brain for coordination. They had good grip, an opposable thumb, so you can hang on to branches as you swung, and they also have great vision. Suddenly, we're going from depending upon your smell to depending upon your eyes. Stereoscopic vision. Their eyes are in the front. They're able to see in stereo. Why? You don't want to run into a vine or a tree, so you want to be able to manipulate yourself. This is the development which leads to organisms like this tarsier. And it's called that because if you look down at its leg right here, it has an elongated ankle bones. Those are the tarsal ankle bones. And the animal is brilliant. I love its eyes. They're oversized, and it has the greatest cornea to eye size ratio of all of the primates, which means it can survive real well at night. It sees real well. It has another adaptation. And that adaptation is a reflector that's built into the eye. Cats have the same thing. Ever take a picture of a cat and its eyes look like they're just glowing back, they're reflecting stuff? Or driving along the road and you see a deer and the deer's eyes just light up? That is due to a special part that is found in the eyes of these animals. Normally, when light enters your eye, in a human eye, it's going to go in through the pupil. It will then strike the photosensitive screen, the retina at the end, and you're able to see. These animals have an added adaptation, and that is another layer behind the retina. And so what happens is when light comes into the eye, it strikes the retina, it registers, but some of it keeps going, but then it gets reflected back, and it's a double shot of light going across the retina, which gives them amplified low light seeing. Finally, the orangutan, the person of the forest, comes from Malaysian and Indonesian. This is one of the apes. Apes do not have tails like monkeys. This guy maybe stands about 5 foot tall, but has an arm span that can be 7 feet wide. This is a male. It has face flaps, you can see there. It can do a number of things, including a kiss squeak. And if you go off to see these in a couple of days, they make a noise, which is incredible. When they get annoyed, and then actually there are some interesting things on linguistics with them, they go, but they also use their hands to change the quality of the sound. So they can communicate and form the basics of what some linguists think is a rudimentary language. Brilliant stuff. That's the male. There's the female. The female does quite a few things. She teaches the kids how to make nests. These guys live up in nests, and when a juvenile reaches 2 or 3 years old, knowing how to make its own bed, its own nest, it leaves the house. How familiar is that? One last thing I want to show with the orangutans is something called object permanence. These guys are brilliant. These are so smart. I mean, you look at these apes and you just see how closely we are related to them. This is a cell phone movie of a young orangutan looking at somebody playing a game with them. They have an object, and it's called object permanence. They put it in the cup, they shake it around, but look at what this guy does. He drops it on the floor, so the object isn't in there anymore. Shows it right back to the orangutan, opens it up. Is that brilliant? Okay, final movie for where we're headed. The 2 ports, upcoming ports, and let's run it right now. There it is. We're looking at that map of the region. We're all familiar with that. In a moment, we're going to start zooming in closer to the island of Borneo. And you can see it right here. The ports that we'll be visiting are up on the left here. And remember, we've changed our orientation north-south. North going off to the left. And let's get a little bit closer. Most likely, we will be berthing here, and the town is further in. And going off to the second place, to Kota Kinabalu. And what I've done here is I've flown into where that cultural center is. So the cultural center is up in the mountains. How many people are going to be doing that? Going to be, I think, a few of you out there. And then I'm going to pull back. And look at the town with the major mountain up there. Any questions? You know you can ask me anytime. My next presentation is Incredible Critters and Remarkable Plants of the Philippines, but you know it's going to be a mix of a whole bunch of things. And also, since it's my last lecture, I've got a special piece. I'm going to end with doing a hands-on bioengineering challenge. So you're going to have to build something. And these pieces that I'm showing you, and we are a great species with culture, and we're able to transfer what we learn to the young. And please, don't let it drop. Do this with your grandchildren. Play with them. Get this stuff, because it's incredible what they can learn from you, especially sharing your experience on here. So Bioengineering Challenge is next, and that is it. Thank you all so much for being here again. Thank you.